Welcome back. In this video, we will see how we can create coding for the user service as well as the helper user class there in order to create a new user in Backendless. So we will basically be creating this function here called create user. You can see that we will be accepting a Backendless user, and that user we want to grow and create in Backendless. Right, so before we do that, let's go to the top and we're going to add a few fields inside of this user service that will help us later on in the UI. Right, so the first field that we're going to use here is a Backendless user field. So it's going to be Backendless user, and it can be nullable. So we're going to have it as nullable, can be null, and we're going to call it, let's say, current user. For this current user, we want to have a getter function there. So we're going to say Backendless user. We have the getter there, and let's call it current user. And we want to get back that value of current user. Right, so we created a field called current user that provider must provide for us just to keep track of the current user and the current user's data. So in order to get back this field, we will just be calling get current user, and we will be returning back the current user. Then we also want to have a Boolean value. Let's call this one user exists. So if the user does exist, we want to show some data on the UI later on. So we're going to use Boolean value for that, and it's going to be called user exists. We also need to have a getter for this one just to pick up if the user exists or not. So we're going to use, let's call this one user exists also. The same name, and then we will be returning back this user exists. Okay, and then we need to show some sort of progress. So with the user service, obviously we need to create a new user or register a new user. So we want to show some progress on how far we are with that, because that takes a second or two or three to actually register something or someone in Backendless. So we will need to show some user progress. Also when we log in the user, also when we reset the password, also when we log out the user. So we will be using this field a lot. So we're going to have a Boolean there, and let's call this one show user progress. And let's set this one to false right at the start. And also let's provide a getter for this. So we're going to have get show. Let's just call this one show user progress, and we return back that show user progress. Then along with the progress indicator, we also need to have some text there. So, sorry, not Boolean. Let's have some string text there. So it's going to be user progress text, and let's set the text as nothing. We will change it inside of the UI later on when we need it, and we're going to have a getter here as well called, let's call this one user progress text, and we will get back the user progress text. So we will show the progress, and with this progress, we will also show some text to the user. So why do we need different text? Because we can tell the user we're busy resetting the password, we're busy logging in a user, we're busy logging out the user, we are busy maybe creating a new user. So the text for all of them will be different. Then for this current user, we also want to have a function here called set the current user to null. And for this, we can actually just go and set the current user to null. So that's when the user then logged out. We will not get a user anymore. So then we set that current user to null. Okay, and then we also need to check whether a user exists or not. So for this user exists, so we need to be able to change this. So we will check in Backendless if the user exists. If the user does not exist, we will come and change this field. So we're going to have a setter there, user exists. We will take in a Boolean value. We will set the user exists to this value that was passed in, and we will notify all the listeners. Right, so these are just a few basic values that we will use provider for in order to provide for us. So we will have a current user where something can change, and we need to look and listen for those changes, where we set the current user to null. For this user exists field, we've got a getter, and we can also set that value of user exists. and notify all the listeners. For the progress, there's a progress value that we can set true or false with the text that goes along with it. Right, so now we can start with this function called create user. Right, so let's look at this function quickly. This function will return back a future string value for me. And that string will be either okay or maybe contain some sort of error. Okay, so in this create user function, we will accept in a backendless user, and that's the user that we want to register online. Okay, so we set the result as okay, and this must be asynchronous because we are sending data to Backendless, and for that we will need to use the await keyword, and because of that we will need to have this function as asynchronous. Okay, so after we set the result to okay, we can maybe start showing the user progress. So I'm going to set the user progress to true. I'm also going to set the user progress text to creating a new user. Please wait. And then I will go and notify all listeners. Right, and now we get to the actual Backendless part of how do we create a new user online. So we will have a try and a catch block here. In order to do this, let's say we will catch an E there. You can make that anything you want. And then inside of this catch block, we will set the result to this exception that could occur. So I'm going to send it to this get human readable error, take the exception, and convert it to a string. Okay, so the result will then go through. We send through this message, and if it contains anything like I've got here email address not confirmed and so forth, then it will return exactly that specific message. But if it's not one of these, then it just returns back the message. So then it could be something else. So we're going to have the try and the catch block. So the catch block will set the result to something else than just okay. Now let's go into this try block. In the try block, I'm going to start with await. We're going to go to the Backendless library. So it's going to be Backendless, and we're going to go to the user service. So this is part of the Backendless class. There's a user service, and if you put the dot on the user service, you will see that there's a few things we can do here. We can get the current user, we can log in the user, we can log out the user, we can register the user, and so forth. So what we want to do here is to actually register a new user. And we need to pass in, so if you hover over that register, you can see we need to pass in a Backendless user. And that's exactly what we accept here as well. So I'm just going to pass in that user and wait for that to return. So if there's an exception, it will go into this get human readable error, and it will return back that result. So for example, if the user already exists when you try to register, it will send through this message. This user already exists in our database. Please create a new user. Okay, so you can obviously go and change these messages a bit. Right, so in this line, there could be some exceptions that occur, and we will catch it inside of this result. But if we get to this line, we know that there was no exception that occurred. That also means that we have got a new user registered now. So after this user has been registered, what I want to do is to go and create a blank to-do entry for him inside of the database. So you remember that we have a class called to-do entry. It's under our models. There's the class, and this one represents a table inside of Backendless. So we're going to create a new entry inside of this class or this table called to-do entry. Let's go back. So we're going to create a new to-do entry. So let's call it empty entry equals creating a new to-do entry. And we need to pass in the to-dos. And if you hover over to-dos, you can see it's a map that's dynamic. So I'm just going to add an empty map there. So that's just an empty JSON file basically that's going to be saved. And for the username, we're going to have the user's email address. So we're going to say user dot, and you can see for every Backendless user, there's an email, a password, some properties. So we're going to say email there. Now we will get to this later on. So you can see that we pass in a Backendless user. So in the UI, we will ask the user for specifics, and we're going to build that Backendless user. We send that Backendless user here to create the user. And using the data that we specified there, one of those properties is the email of the user. So inside of this to-do entry, you will remember that we need to-dos, and the username. These three will automatically be created online for us, so we don't need to set them. Now I just need to send this empty entry now to the table called to-do entry. So for this, I'm going to use await again. I'm going to go to Backendless, and instead of just using backendless.register or .userservice.register, I want to go to a specific data table now. I need to specify the data table where I want to save this data, and you just use the of function there and specify a table name. So if you hover over of, the table name must be a string. Okay, so the table name in Backendless will be called exactly the same as our class that we have here. So it is also to-do entry. What do I want to do on that table? You can see I can create something, I can find something, I can delete something, remove, save, whatever I want to do. So in this case, we want to save a new entity there, or a new object. Now, if you hover over the save function, you can see that we need to pass in an entity that's a map that's dynamic. Okay, so we already have that as part of the to-do class. Now, if you go to your to-do entry, if you go to this class, you can see that we've got a to.json that converts this object to a JSON file, and we also got a from JSON that converts the JSON file to a to-do entry again. So at this stage, we have the to-do entry, and we want to convert it to a JSON file. So we will go to that empty entry and convert it to a JSON file. And that is then this map that we see there. So we need to pass in a map there, and that's exactly what this to.json function will do for me. It will convert that empty entry to a JSON file or to a map. Right, so we can actually close it off here. But if we want to handle some errors there, we can just put the dot there, and you can see that there's a function called onError. So if there's an error, we want to also be able to do something there. So if there's an error, we will have a stack trace and we will have the error there. So instead of having this fat arrow there, I'm going to use the opening and closing brace there. Okay, so inside of this onError, what do we want to do? Well, I want to change this result again. So I'm going to set the result as error.toString, and that toString function will give me the error as text. So that's the error that could occur, and we are saving that error as a string to result. So just remember, this get human readable error is in fact just for the user service. Whereas in this part, we are actually saving to a data table called to-do entry. Okay, so we will not send it to the get human readable error. Okay, we're just getting that result directly. Right, so let's just recap again. What did we do here? As soon as we call create user, we pass in the Backendless user. We set the result to OK. We start showing the user progress. We set the user progress text to creating a new user. Please wait. We notify the listeners. Then we go and we try to register this new user that was passed in, this one. We create, if this one is correct and everything worked, then we go to this line, which creates an empty entry into the to-do entry table. And for that table, we need only to-dos, the list of to-dos, which will be in a JSON format or in a map. So we save it as an empty map. And for the username, it will be the user that is currently logged in here, or the user that you want to try and create. In this case, it's the same user that was passed in. So after this line, we know that the user was successfully created. So we create a blank entry for him in the database. Then we need to send this blank entry now to the table in Backendless. So this line basically takes care of that part. So we go to backendless.data, specify in which table you want to save it, and go and save using some JSON value, or basically a map. How do we convert that? Well, if you want to go to that to.json, just hold down Control, click on that to.json. What are we doing? We're setting the username to the username. We're setting the to-dos to the to-dos. We're setting created to created, updated to updated, and object ID to object ID. Okay, so basically just setting all the fields as a key and a value pair. And that's exactly how Backendless handles the data that you send to it. For every column inside of your database in Backendless, you will need to have a key. And these keys must be exactly the same spelling as the columns for your to-do entry in Backendless. Now let's go back. So we save that as a map with key and value pairs. The keys represent the column names and the values will be the values for that column. If there's an error that occurs, we will have the error and we convert it to a string, set that as the result. And then at the end, we can return back the result. But before we get to that part, remember at this stage, if we get to this line, we know that we registered a new user, we created a new blank entry for him without any errors. Or there could have been some errors here or maybe there. But at this stage, we are done with the process. So remember at the top, we said, let's show the progress here. And that's the text. So here we must stop showing it because now we're done. So we're going to say, show the user progress will be set to false now again. So we are done with that and we can notify the listeners. I don't need to change the text right now because this user progress will contain the text. So we're just hiding it basically. As soon as we want to use this again, we will set it again. So we just notify the listeners that we should not show the progress anymore. And then we're done. Okay, so I'm just going to remove some of these empty lines here. And then you can save. Right, let's quickly go back to Backendless. And I want you to go to your data tab on the left-hand side. So make sure you're still at your normal to-do application and go to data. So let us quickly create this table that we are referring to now. So remember that we are creating a table called to-do entry. So if we go to to-do entry quickly, this is the table that we want to create in Backendless. So if I look at Backendless again, the table I want to create must have exactly that spelling. So I'm going to add a new table here, and I'm going to call this one to-do entry, and you can create it. We're going to say yes there, and the first one is called to-dos. The first field or the first column will be called to-dos. We're going to set this one as a JSON because that will contain JSON data and we can create this column. Then we're also going to create a new column there and that one is for the username. So I'm going to call this one username. It's going to be a string. The max length is fine and we can just create it. Okay, so if I go to my data browser now, you will basically see the exact same thing that we have for this class. There's the to-do entry. There's your to-dos. There's your username. To-dos is of type JSON. In our case, is of type map, but it's the same thing. Username is a string. Now, if you go down, you can see your object ID will be there. Your owner ID, we don't really need that. And we want to see the created and the updated. So if you wanted to have the owner ID also, you can see it's also a string. You can also add it here. Okay, just note that all should be nullable. Okay, so basically we've set up this to-do entry. So as soon as we create a new user now using the app, that new user will lie inside of this users table. So we will see a new user created here, but we will also see a new entry inside of this table for that user. Okay, so I'm just going to minimize this for now so you can see how this class then correlates to what we have online. Okay, so let's go back to the user service. And for the user service, we have this create user created now. So this function is done. Now, alongside this create user, we also need to check if the user actually exists before we want to go and create this user. So let's quickly do this function as well. Now, for this function, you can see that we're passing in a username here. So the idea is that inside of this register page, if you go to pages and you go to register, inside of the register page where we ask him to enter his email address, as that specific person will be typing, we will checking the focus there. And if there's a focus change and he starts typing, we want to send whatever he types there in this email address to this function. So we're passing in whatever he types there because that will become the username. So if you look at your register, we are asking please enter your email address and that will become the username. Okay, so we're passing in that username here and every time he types, we will be checking if that user actually exists or not. Okay, so it's also asynchronous because we need to check it against our user table inside of Backendless. Okay, so for this, we need to run a query on the user table. So in order to do that, we're going to make use of a class called the data query builder. So in the data query builder, we're just going to create a variable called query builder, and we're going to initialize it as a data query builder. Right, so part of this data query builder, we want to add a where clause. So at the end of this data query builder, I'm just going to add 2 dots there, and we're going to use a where clause. The where clause will be set to, so I'm just going to add an enter after this. The where clause will be set to something that I want to test against. So in this case, please make use of the double quotation mark here. So I'm going to set the email is equal to, and this is why I need the double quotation marks, because I need to have single ones inside. So I want to have where the email is equal to this username that was passed in. So I want to use the $sign there and use this username. Okay, so basically I want to run a query on the user table where the email is equal to this email. And if it returns back some data, then we know the user already exists. Otherwise, the user does not exist. Right, so now let's run that query. So I'm going to use await. I'm going to go to backendless.data. So it's in one of the data tables, and that table is called the user table. So instead of doing what we did here to say of, for the user table, we're going to use with class, and there's a specific class that we want to work with here. So just go to the specific class, and that's the Backendless user class. So just to make this a bit more readable, I'm going to move this to a next line. So it's with class, and then in the Backendless user class, we want to find. And we want to find also using a query builder. So we're going to say query builder there, which will basically go and say, go to the Backendless user class and find where the email is equal to the username that was passed in. Then if you find it, or maybe did not find it, we will go to the then part of it. So if it's done, we want to do something. Now again, I'm not going to use the fat arrow here. I'm going to use the opening and closing bracket. So when it's done, just hover over that value, and you can see it gives me a list of Backendless users. So what did we do here? We said, well, this is the where clause where the email is equal to the username. So it will give me back a list of Backendless users where the email is equal to the username. But because we know that's a unique value, we know that we will be either getting back one value in the list or nothing at all. So inside of this brackets, let's test that quickly. So I'm going to say if this value is equal to null, or this value dot length, so that's the, remember, value is a list. So if the length is 0, or the length is, we can say also not equal to 1, let's just keep it as equal to 0. If the length is 0, or the value is null, then we know that this user does not exist, and it's fine, we can create the user. Okay, so if the value is null or the value.length is 0, which means that there is no user found, then we can set this user exists. So remember, we created this at the top. There's user exists. We set that user exists to false, just to make sure it is false, because then the user does not exist. And we will notify the listeners. The else part here will then be the user actually exists. So then we're going to set user exists to true, and we will also notify any listeners. Right, and then we can save. So checking if the user exists, we pass in the username. We set up a data query builder with a where clause where the email is equal to the username. We go into the Backendless user class, run that query, get back a value. That value will either contain one Backendless user that already exists, or it will not. So if the value is null or the length is 0, then we know that that user does not exist. Else will not be null, and also it will be a value of 1. Then we set the user exists to true, because then the user exists, and we notify the listeners. So if we want to have some error handling here as well, you can just put a dot there at the end and say on error again, so like we did previously. So just an opening and a closing bracket again there. We have the error there. So maybe for now we can just print something in the console. But you can do something there if you wanted to. So I'm just going to say error dot, use it without that. So we can say error dot toString. So if there's any error that's happening, then we will just print it in the console for now. Okay, so that is just adding some error handling there as well. So checking if the user exists, we pass in the username, check if the user exists, and update user exists, either to false or to true. Right, so we are done with the user service here in order to check if the user exists and to create a new user. So now let's go to this helper class, this helper user. And what we want to do here is to create this new user now in the UI. So in the UI, we will call this function called create new user in UI. And this function will then call this user service called create user. Okay, so for this function, you can see that it accepts the context. It needs an email, a password, and the name of the user that we want to register. So in the UI, we ask for the email, we ask for the password, we ask for the name, and we pass in the build context. Now, the first line I'm going to use here is something that we call a focus manager. I'm going to call instance on it. I'm going to go to the primary focus, and I'm going to call unfocus. So this is just to make sure that after we send, or as soon as we call create new user in UI, we will actually be unfocusing the keyboard so that the keyboard closes down. Okay, so this is how you can do that. So that's focus manager.instance.primary focus. It can be null. So just put a question mark there and we unfocus it. Okay, so that the keyboard will close down. Now, inside of this function, we can just maybe test here if the email that was passed in is empty, or the name that was passed in is empty, or the password that was passed in is empty. Because if any one of those are empty, then we cannot actually create a new user because we need those values. So then I'm going to call that show snack bar. Now remember, the show snack bar is under, I think it's under widgets, and there you see dialogues, and there's your show snack bar. So we're going to show a snack bar on the UI, and we pass in the context, and we need to have some sort of a message there. Okay, so the message will just be, please enter all fields. If you want to have it nicely formatted, place a comma at the end, and it will nicely format it for you. So if any one of these fields are empty, we will just show the snack bar and telling the user that, please enter your data first before you do anything else. Now the else part is all of those fields have values. So now we can start creating that new user. So we will create a new Backendless user. So remember, if you go back to user service, we create a new user by sending in a Backendless user. So that's exactly what we will be doing here. We will take this email, the password, and the name, and we will create this Backendless user. Okay, so I'm going to say, just type that again, Backendless user. So if you select it, you can see that it gets imported at the top, the Backendless SDK. And let's call it user as well, equals a new Backendless user. For this Backendless user, so instead of just ending it off with the semicolon there, I'm going to go to a new line, just maybe indent it a bit, and I'm going to set a few values. So just put the double dot there, and we're going to set the email. Now the email will be this email field that we passed in. So you can just say email there, or you can maybe add something like the trim method there to make sure that if there's any trailing or leading white space in the email that the user typed, that gets removed. Okay, so we're going to set the email. That's very important. We're also going to set the password, and the password will come from the password field. And again, I'm just going to use the trim method there, or the trim function. After the password and the email has been set, so these two we need to set, the email and the password. But if you want to, you can also go and create some other fields inside of your user table. So for example, you can see there's email, there's name already. But you can add some more properties here, like the address of the person or whatever you want. And if that is something that you want to add, for instance, this name now, this is one of the columns that you can specify. You can change this. But the password and the email must be there. So that is why we need to set them with this double dot. So we set the email and the password. For anything else than the email or the password, you're going to use a function called put properties. Now again, you work with JSON data when you send it to Backendless or a map. So I'm going to use a map, and the only thing I need for this map is a key that will become the column name and the value that you want to put in that column. Okay, so the key in our case will be name. So if you look at Backendless again, we will have a column there called name, and we want to save that name. So in order to save the value there, I will need to go to put properties. The key is the column name, so that's name, and the value is this name that we pass through. So there's a name that we pass through. Again, I'm going to use trim on it to make sure that we get the correct value or a trimmed value. Now you can put the comma there or just leave it out. Won't really make a difference. Right, and that's it. We've created a new Backendless user. Okay, so for the Backendless user, you set the email and the password. If there's any other columns that you want to create or set there, you will indicate them here. Right, now we need to go and create this new user. So how do we create this new user? Well, in the user service, there's a function called create new user or create user. So let's go back to the helper class. We basically just need to call that function in order to create this new user. So I'm going to set up a result. And why is there a result? Because this user service or this create user sends back a future result. And that result there at the bottom will either be okay if everything went fine, or it will contain an error. So we're going to get that result back, and that will be awaiting that specific function. So we're going to go to context. So remember, we pass in the build context there. On that context, we're going to call read. Now we don't have a provider imported yet in this class, so I'm just going to type provider. Let's just select it there, remove it, and then provider should be at the top right. Okay, so we're going to use read there. We want to read from the user service. So that is the class, this user service that's providing the data. We want to read from this one. And there is a function called, let's just add the brackets there. We're going to use a function called create user, and we will be passing in that Backendless user. Okay, so this is how we call then this user service class there, or the user service. This one, we want to use the create user function there. Okay, so if we go back there, that's how we did it. We just said go to context.read from the user service, create the new user. Now let's just look at that result quickly. So if that result is not equal to okay, then we know something went wrong there. So I'm going to show the snack bar, and the message there will just be this result. The else here means that everything went fine. So I'm going to show a snack bar again, and the message will be new user successfully created. And remember, in this part where we call create a new user, we are actually in the registration page. So it will be in this register page where we call this. So what we want to do also is to maybe close down this register page. So I'm going to use navigator.pop, and I'm just going to pop the context, which means we're going to be at the login screen again. So remember, from the login screen, you can get to the register screen. In the register screen, we will run create new user in the UI. It will go through everything, create the new Backendless user, create it using the user service create user, and then return back a result. If it was okay, we show the snack bar with the result. If it's not okay, we will show the error. Otherwise, we will show new user successfully created and pop it off the stack, which means the register screen will close and we will be back at the login screen. Right, so now we can go to the register page. So just go to your pages, go to register.dart, and you can see that we've got a username controller, the name controller, the password controller, and that we're going to get the data from. Okay, so if you move down, you will see there's register user, and then we get to this focus part. So this is part of this app text field, and the text field will say, please enter your email address. So where it says, please enter your email address, we will have this focus class on it, or this focus widget on it. Now, let's have a look at this on focus change. This is called with true if the widget's node gains focus, and false if it loses focus. So I'm testing here in the if statement there, if not true. So it's basically if it's false, if that value is false, what does it mean? It means it lost focus, which means the user are done typing its email address and he moved to a new field. So as soon as that happens, we want to check if that user that he typed actually exists. So now remember, in our user service, we have this check if user exists. So we just want to make use of this function here. So let's go back to register. And inside of this if statement, we want to use that function. So I'm going to use context dot read again. Now I think provider is also not in here yet. So let's just type provider there and make sure that, yes, it is included at the top. Okay, so let's go to context again, dot read again. And the type of the class that we want to read from is again the user service. Okay, and on that user service, we want to make use of the check if user exists function. For that function, we need a username. Okay, so how will we get the username? Well, remember he typed the username here and it's saved inside of this username controller. So we're going to use that username controller dot text and we want to trim whatever the user typed there. Okay, so we're going to check if the user exists. And what will happen then? It will go to this function called check if the user exists. It passes through the username, checks the username in the database online, and it will notify me whether the user exists or not. Okay, so we can use this field now, user exists, in order to see whether the user exists or not. So let's go back to the register screen. Now, just above this, please enter your name, or maybe just above this, please enter your email address. Well, it's your choice where you want to place it. So I'm going to place it in between these two. So please enter your email address. So if the email address already exists, I want to show a text widget right underneath this one that says, please enter your email address. Okay, so let's make use of a selector to look at a specific value because there's only one value that I want to check for now here, and that's in the user service, and we want to check for this user exists. So remember, we're making use of this check if user exists, and we are changing user exists. So there's only one value I want to look at. So I'm going to use selector. We're going to look at the user service again. The value I want to check is a Boolean value, and I can close it off. Okay, so now inside of this, if you hover over it, you can see there's a parameter selector and builder that's required. So let's start off with selector. So for the selector, we will use a context and we will use a value and we will return back value dot user exists. Okay, so if you hover over value there, you will see it is of type user service class, and the value inside of the user service class that we want to have a look at is called user exists. So now let's just go to the builder property there. And for the builder property, again, we're going to have a context there. We're going to have a value there, which we'll look at now, and there will be a child. And then we just ended off with the two opening and closing brackets. Now, remember, we need to return back something. So let's just quickly have a look at this. Value is this Boolean value called user exists. Okay, so we want to return back now something based on this value. So this value now is whether the user exists or not. So it's this one. So if you hover over it, it's that bool value. It's a Boolean, and that is this value that we're looking at, user exists. So if the user exists, then we want to show a text widget. And the text widget must show the text username exists. Please choose another. Now let's just set a style for this text widget also. And let's use a text style. Let's make the color as colors.red. And let's set the font weight as font weight.bold. Let's just put a comma there at the end. Let's just put the otherwise there. I'm just going to add a container for now. And then end it off. Okay, so that we can just see what we've typed here. Okay, so if the value is in fact true, which means that the user exists, we're going to show username exists, please choose another, with the style color red, and it will be bold. Otherwise, we can show just an empty container. Why just an empty container? Basically, we then do not want to show a text field at all, because then it's fine. Okay, so I hope you understand this part. We will look at just user exists. If the user exists, we're going to show this text widget. User exists, please choose another. That will be red and bold. Otherwise, we're just going to leave it as it is. We will not be showing a text widget at all. Because everything's fine, we can allow him to actually register. Now let's just move down a bit, and you can see this is the register button. It is your elevated button, and there's the on pressed. So if everything is fine, then we can now send this data through to this helper function that we used, or we created there, create new user in UI. We need to pass the context, the email, the password, and the name, and then we're done. Okay, so let's go back to the register page. So inside of this on pressed, I'm going to use that create new user in UI, and you can see I don't need to refer to a specific class, because in this helper class, or in this helper file, helper ... this is not a specific class. I've got just a few functions mentioned here, and I can use them directly anywhere I want. Okay, so I'm going to create a new user in the UI. The context is already there. I need the email. So where am I going to get the email? Well, that will be coming from the username controller.text.trim. The password will come from the password controller.text.trim. Let me just put a comma there at the end. Wow, doesn't want to do it. Okay, let me just add an enter here. And then for the name, we're going to use the name controller.text.trim. Okay, and then we end it off with a semicolon. All right, so what is going to happen? We're going to call this create new user in UI. We're passing the email, the password, and the name. That gets passed into this user service, the email, password, the name. We check if they are empty or not. We tell them to enter all fields. We create the new Backendless user using that email, password, and the name. We call create user. What is create user going to do? It's going to go into this create user. It will start showing the progress, and we will set up that everything we've done here. So let's go back to the register page. The only thing that we need to still do here is to add some sort of progress bar. Okay, so let's go into just after this positioned, and I'm going to use a new selector here. Now, for this selector, we want to actually look at two different values. So I'm going to look at the user service, but remember in the user service, there's two values that we need to look at. So we need to look at both the show user progress and the user progress text. So there's two values that we need to look at. So normally for selector, we only look at one thing. So that's why I'm going to use this tuple class. And this tuple class helps me, or tuple2 will help me to look at two different values here. So I'll show you now how that works. Okay, so inside of the selector, again, we need to have the selector. So for selector, I'm going to use context and the value. Then we're going to return back a new tuple2. Okay, and for this one, the tuple class, if you hover over it, you can see that I need to have a dynamic item 1 and a dynamic item 2. So for item 1, so if you hover over value, you can see it's the user service. So for value 1, the first item there, I'm going to have value.show progress, or show user progress. For item 2 that I want to listen for, I'm going to use value.user progress text. Okay, so this is how tuple actually helps me, that I can look at one class called user service, but I can look at two different values. So the first item is value.show user progress. The second item is value.progress text. Okay, and then we also need to have the builder here. So I'm going to use builder. Again, the context. Again, some value and a child. Let's have some brackets there, and we need to return something. So if you hover over value, you can see it's the tuple that it's returning. And that tuple contains the user progress and the user progress text. Okay, so let's return the following. We're first going to check value.item1. So value.item1 is the show user progress. It's the first one. Okay, so that's the show user progress. If the show user progress is true, then we're going to show the app progress indicator. And the text that we want to display in that app progress bar or that app progress indicator will be this user progress text. So that's item 2 in the tuple. So value.item1 is the user progress. And let me just add some text there. Value.item2 will be the progress text. And the last part is to just actually show an empty container. So if we need to show the user progress, we will show it, the app progress bar with the text. Otherwise, we just show an empty container. Okay, so let's run this quickly. Let me just get in my virtual device here. Let's go to main.dart and let's run the app as it is. Right, so the app is running. So let's go to register a new user, enter your email address. Let's say chuck.norris@gmail.com. And please enter your name. I'm going to say Chuck there. Please enter your password 123. So if I leave out one of these fields and I click on register, it will show please enter all fields. Okay, so I'm going to add 123 and I'm going to register. So it's creating a new user. Please wait. And it says new user successfully created. Okay, so let's look at Backendless now. Did we see anything? We've made our first API call. So you can see in the users table, we've got that chuck.norris@gmail.com. There's Chuck, the name. You can see there's a user status and so forth. There's the password, created, updated, and so forth. And then let's go to our to-do entry. And you can see we've got one empty entry. It's an empty JSON file. chuck.norris@gmail.com is the username. 100% as we wanted to. Okay, so now let's just have a look at this users table again. So the only user we have here is chuck.norris. So if I go and I try to register a new user with the exact same thing, I'm going to say chuck.norris@gmail.com and I move away the focus and I start typing. You can see it was not that fast, but at least it gets there. It says the username exists, please choose another, and maybe we can add some space there. So it tells me the username already exists. So I can go and change, maybe do just chuck@gmail.com. Enter your name, Chuck, and the password 123. And you can see now that error is gone because chuck@gmail does not exist, but it will now be added. Oh, something went wrong there. Let's just see again. Duplicate value Chuck for column name. Okay, so it doesn't like that. So what we can do in the schema is to just go and have a look at that name and remove some of these. Doesn't need to be a unique value. So we can just remove that from the column and then go back to the data browser and let's see if we can register it now. Yes, there we go. Okay, been registered, chuck@gmail.com. It can have the same name unless you didn't want that. But in our case, it doesn't matter. The emails must be unique. Okay, and that is the first part of registering a new user. So in the next video, I will meet you again and we can see how we can log in a user. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next one.